This is a homily for the 20th Sunday in Ordinary Time. The first reading is from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 56, verse 1 and verses 6 and 7. The second reading comes from St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 11, verses 13 to 15 and verses 29 to 32. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 15, verses 21 to 28. To download the text of this homily as a PDF file, go to sundayhomilies.au. We are still with Jesus and his disciples during the Galilean ministry. However, today's Gospel is not set in Galilee. One of the most significant details in this story is its setting. Following the feeding of the multitude, Jesus and the disciples crossed from the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee and came to land at Gennesaret. Gennesaret is not a town, but a fertile plain on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, between Capernaum and Magdala. Matthew tells us that Jesus left Gennesaret and withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon, two cities on the Mediterranean coast. That would have been a journey of more than 80 kilometres. Matthew's point is that Jesus deliberately leaves Galilee and heads into territory associated with the Gentile world. Tyre and Sidon lay to the northwest of Galilee in what is now Lebanon. For centuries they had represented the pagan nations surrounding Israel. In the Old Testament, these cities were often viewed with suspicion. It was from Sidon that Jezebel came, bringing the worship of Baal into Israel. To a Jewish audience, Tyre and Sidon stood for the world beyond the covenant. The first person who approaches Jesus in this foreign region is not a disciple, not even a fellow Jew. Matthew calls her a Canaanite. The word Canaanite is used anachronistically here. By the first century, nobody would have described this woman as a Canaanite. The Canaanites were the ancient inhabitants of the land, and Matthew's use of the term is rather like referring to a modern French person as a Gaul. In Israel's memory, the Canaanites were associated with the pagan peoples of the land whose religious practices repeatedly tempted Israel into idolatry. Mark calls the woman a Syro-Phoenician, which is how people in Jesus' day would have identified her. Matthew's use of the older term Canaanite deliberately accentuates the distance between Jesus and the woman. She is not Jewish. She belongs to the Gentile world and, in Israel's collective memory, to a people long associated with paganism and opposition to God's purposes. In Jesus' own day, there was considerable tension between Galilee and the wealthy coastal city of Tyre, which depended heavily on agricultural produce from the surrounding Jewish regions. Many Galileans would have regarded Tyre as a prosperous Gentile city that benefited from resources produced by Jewish peasants. Let's place Jesus' meeting with the Canaanite woman into context. Last Sunday, we heard the story of the disciples on the lake, battling a raging storm. Jesus comes to them walking across the water. Peter gets out of the boat and starts walking towards Jesus. But as soon as he feels the force of the wind, he takes fright and begins to sink. Jesus takes him by the hand and says to him, "You have so little faith. Why did you doubt?" Matthew tells us that after the storm had subsided, the disciples came ashore at Gennesaret. The locals, recognizing Jesus, bring their sick to him. At this point, Matthew introduces a delegation of Pharisees and scribes from Jerusalem. They ask Jesus a question. "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They eat without washing their hands." This is a question about ritual purity. Ritual purity was not about hygiene, nor was it about morality. It was part of the law of Moses, which distinguished between what was clean and what was unclean. These laws govern many aspects of Jewish life, including which foods could and could not be eaten, what we would today call kosher laws. They also determined what conditions rendered a person ritually unclean and who could enter the temple and participate in its worship. A person could become ritually unclean through a variety of ordinary experiences of life: contact with a dead body, certain diseases, and other conditions specified in the law. This did not mean that they had sinned. It simply meant that they had to undergo purification before they could once again enter the temple. The form that purification took varied. It might involve washing, a period of separation from the temple, or, in some cases, the offering of a sacrifice. The Pharisees took this idea one step further. They believed that the purity required for worship in the temple should not be confined to the temple alone. It should shape ordinary life as well. In effect, they sought to bring the standards of the temple into the home, the marketplace, and even the dining table. That explains the background to the question they put to Jesus about washing hands before eating. Their concern is not hygiene, it is ritual purity. Jesus' response is startling. He does not reject the law of Moses. On the contrary, he accuses the Pharisees of setting aside God's commandment in favour of their own traditions. Quoting the prophet Isaiah, he says, "This people honours me with their lips, but their heart is far from me." His criticism is directed not at the law itself, but at human regulations that have come to obscure God's intention. Only then does Jesus go on to make his deeper point. A person is not made unclean by what enters the mouth, but by what comes out of it. The deepest form of impurity is not ritual impurity, but moral impurity. Evil thoughts, murder, adultery, slander, and every kind of wickedness do far more damage to a person's relationship with God than any failure to observe the rules of ritual purity. Matthew presents us with three very different responses to Jesus. Peter responds with little faith. The delegation of Pharisees and scribes who have come all the way from Jerusalem are religious experts. They know the law. They belong to the covenant people of Israel, yet they challenge Jesus and reject his teaching. The Canaanite woman, by contrast, is not even Jewish, yet she recognizes who Jesus is and throws herself upon his mercy. She addresses Jesus as Son of David, a specifically Jewish messianic title. The irony is that this Gentile woman recognizes Jesus as Israel's Messiah before many of his own people do. Before the story is over, Jesus will say to her, "Woman, great is your faith." In Matthew's Gospel, faith is not primarily a matter of believing certain doctrines to be true. It is trust. It is the willingness to entrust oneself to Jesus and to rely upon him completely. Peter has enough faith to step out of the boat, But when he sees the strength of the wind, he becomes afraid and begins to sink. His problem is not that he stops believing in Jesus. His problem is that fear overwhelms trust. The Canaanite woman provides the opposite example. She refuses to be discouraged by silence, rejection, or apparent refusal. She persists because she is utterly convinced that Jesus can help her. Her faith is not simply intellectual conviction, it is a stubborn, persistent trust that clings to Jesus despite every obstacle. That is why Peter is described as having little faith, while the Canaanite woman is praised for her great faith. The difference lies not in what they believe about Jesus, but in the extent to which they are prepared to trust him. Significantly, the only people whose faith Jesus explicitly describes as great in Matthew's Gospel are both Gentiles, a Roman centurion and this Canaanite woman. Before we have a closer look at the encounter between Jesus and this Canaanite woman, let us ask about Matthew's community. Who was he writing this Gospel for? Every 4 years in Australia, we have to complete a census form. One of the questions asks, what is the person's religion? If the community for whom Matthew was writing his Gospel were to respond to a question like that, they would write down Jewish. The fact that they had accepted that Jesus was God's anointed one, the Messiah or the Christ, didn't mean for them that they were no longer Jews. Quite the contrary. They believed that by accepting Jesus as the Messiah, their Jewish faith had been brought to its fulfillment. However, that belief was not shared by most Jews, and it will eventually lead to a split between Jews who accepted that Jesus was the Messiah and those who did not. In time, these two groups went in very different directions, eventually becoming two quite distinct religions. But that final and definitive split hadn't yet occurred when Matthew was writing his Gospel. In fact, the parting of the ways between what we today know as two different religions, Judaism and Christianity, wasn't final or complete until much later. In addition to that, the church was slowly becoming a Gentile movement. As we'll see in a moment, Matthew's Gospel is preparing his readers for this eventuality. St. Paul, writing about 20 years before Matthew, was at the forefront of bringing the gospel message to the Gentiles, as we hear in today's second reading. To you Gentiles then, in as far as I am apostle to the Gentiles, I take pride in my work of service, if in any way I may rouse my own people to jealousy, and so save some of them. Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, is obviously saddened that so many of his own people have rejected the good news. He hopes that the response of the Gentiles will provoke some of his fellow Jews to reconsider their rejection of Christ and so be saved. So Matthew's Gospel is helping his congregation to retain their allegiance to their ancestral scriptures. But he also wants to show how the story of Jesus has brought the story of Israel to its God-ordained goal. Matthew's congregation is living through a profound transition. Jesus has been revealed as Israel's Messiah, yet more and more of those who become his disciples are Gentiles rather than Jews. Matthew may well be appealing to hardliners in his community who insisted that you had to be Jewish before you could become a disciple of Jesus. We certainly know that St. Paul encountered hardliners like that in Galatia. So let's see how Matthew's Gospel prepares his congregation for this new world which will include Gentiles. All of this helps us understand why Matthew includes the story of the Canaanite woman. Keep in mind what St. John had to say at the very end of his Gospel. He writes, "There was much else that Jesus did. If it were written down in detail, I do not suppose the world itself would hold all the books that would be written." Now, each of the evangelists could have said exactly the same thing. They all knew a great deal more about the life and teaching of Jesus than they included in their Gospel. So, that leads us to ask the question, why did Matthew include this particular story? Matthew begins his Gospel with the genealogy of Jesus. For Matthew, the story of Jesus Christ begins with Abraham begetting Isaac. In other words, the opening stage of the story of Jesus Christ is the story of the Hebrew patriarchs, the kings of Judah and other Israelites. But, surprisingly, Matthew's genealogy also includes 4 women, 2 of whom, Tamar and Rahab, are Canaanites like the woman we meet in today's Gospel. From the very beginning, Matthew hints that God's plan of salvation will extend beyond Israel. Then we have the story of the wise men from the east who come to pay homage to the newly born King of the Jews. Following a star, they reach Jerusalem and begin asking, "Where is the infant King of the Jews?" It's important to keep in mind that these wise men or magi are not Jewish. When King Herod hears about an infant king of the Jews, he is alarmed. There's only room for one king, and that's himself. So King Herod summons the chief priests and scribes, asking them where the Messiah is to be born. They are able to tell him straight away, quoting the prophet Micah, "In Bethlehem, in the land of Judah." The wise men set out for Bethlehem and they find the child. But the chief priests and scribes remain right where they are in Jerusalem. They don't budge. So here, at the very beginning of the Gospel, we have wise men who are Gentiles seeking Jesus, but the Jewish leadership remains unmoved. At the very end of the Gospel, the risen Lord commands his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations, baptize them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Note, all nations, not just Jews. The story of the Canaanite woman occurs at a pivotal point in Matthew's Gospel. The inclusion of the Gentiles has been hinted at from the very beginning, but here it moves to centre stage. The irony is unmistakable. The religious leaders from Jerusalem reject Jesus, while a Canaanite woman recognizes who he is and places her trust in him. So let's now take a closer look at the encounter between Jesus and the Canaanite woman. The woman approaches Jesus, addressing him by the very Jewish title, Son of David. "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is tormented by a demon." Jesus gives her no reply. The disciples appeal directly to Jesus about the woman, asking him to send her away. Get rid of her, because she keeps shouting after us. It sounds as though the disciples simply want to get rid of the woman because she has become a nuisance. Jesus responds, but he addresses the disciples, not the woman. He tells the disciples that he was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. In other words, God's saving purpose begins with Israel. The time will come, though, when the nations are gathered in as well, but Israel has priority in the divine plan. Matthew is distinctive among the evangelists in that he twice narrates scenes in which Jesus refers to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, in chapter 10 verse 6 and here in chapter 15 verse 24. This phrase appears only in Matthew and has no parallel in any of the other Gospels. We find here echoes of the prophet Jeremiah. Lost sheep, such were my people. Their shepherds led them astray. Matthew's allusion suggests that Jesus sees his mission in terms of restoring God's scattered and wayward people. The woman then approaches Jesus a second time, kneeling before him and begging, "Lord, help me." Jesus now addresses her directly, and his words sound unsympathetic. He declines her request and offers his rationale for not granting it by way of a parable. It is not right to take the children's food and throw it to dogs. In other words, the blessings associated with Israel's Messiah belong first to Israel. These seem like harsh words. The assumption in what Jesus is saying is that the children represent Israel and dogs represent Gentiles. Well-to-do Greeks, unlike Jews, raise dogs as pets. The Jewish tradition doesn't think kindly of dogs, and the Hebrew scriptures seem unfamiliar with any kind of warm relationship between a dog and its master. However, the harshness of the saying about dogs here is softened a little by the use of the diminutive kunarion, which means a little dog or household pet, in contrast to a dog from the street or the farm. But this feisty woman, undeterred and persistent, completes the parable. "Yes, Lord, but even dogs eat the scraps that fall from their master's table." She accepts the priority of Israel in God's plan of salvation, but she also says, in so many words, "You are Israel's Messiah. You are the one through whom God will bring salvation to the whole world. Please allow God's plan for the future of the whole world to break into this present moment and bring healing to my daughter." She is not arguing against Israel's election. She is not asking Jesus to abandon his mission to Israel. She is asking for an exception, a foretaste, an advance installment of what God intends eventually to do for all nations. The eventual inclusion of Gentiles is also the focus of the first reading from the prophet Isaiah. Following the return from exile in Babylon, the prophet draws attention to the foreigners who, although outside the community of Israel, are showing their desire to become part of it. As for foreigners who attach themselves to the Lord to serve him, to love the Lord's name, and be his servants, all who observe the Sabbath, not profaning it, and hold fast to my covenant, these I shall lead to my holy mountain, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Jesus is moved and responds, "Woman, you have great faith. Let your wish be granted." In the previous chapter, Jesus had said to Peter, "You of little faith." The irony is striking. A Gentile woman displays the very quality that one of Jesus' closest disciples lacked. New Testament scholar Brendan Byrne offers this reflection on what is happening here. It is not easy for modern readers to grasp the immensity of the barrier being broken through here, one that preoccupied the church for at least 2 generations. Our problem is the other way round, to appreciate sufficiently the particular place of Israel and the Jewish people in the covenant fidelity of God. The woman stands in for all of us Gentiles. We can learn from her faith, but we can also learn from her humble and honest acceptance of Israel's priority in the divine scheme of salvation. Today's Gospel reminds us how central the people of Israel are in God's plan. The Second Vatican Council, in the Declaration on the Relation of the Church to Non-Christian Religions, reminds us that in God's plan of salvation, the beginning of the Church's faith and election is to be found in the patriarchs, Moses, and the prophets. Nor can the Church forget that she draws nourishment from that good olive tree onto which the wild olive branches of the Gentiles have been grafted. The Second Vatican Council's teaching remains important today. For many centuries, Christians did not always appreciate how deeply their faith was rooted in God's covenant with Israel. At times, this ignorance contributed to prejudice and hostility towards the Jewish people with tragic consequences. The Church now reminds us that the God revealed in Jesus Christ is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that Christians can never understand themselves apart from the people of Israel. In fact, Matthew's Gospel makes this point from beginning to end. Jesus is not presented as the founder of a new religion detached from Israel. He is presented as Israel's Messiah, the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham, Moses, and the prophets. The Gentiles are not invited to abandon Israel's story and begin a different one. They are invited to find their place within that story. In the end, this story in today's Gospel is about much more than the healing of one woman's daughter. It is about the widening of God's saving purpose. Jesus comes first to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But the day is coming when people from every nation will find a place at God's table. And it is about faith. Peter had little faith. The Pharisees and scribes refused faith. The Canaanite woman displayed great faith. In the end, it is her faith that gains her a place at the table. She entrusts herself completely to the mercy of Jesus, and she discovers that God's mercy is greater than she ever imagined.